Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone, our panelists, our attendees, and my colleagues on this beautiful Thursday afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Hanna Hölling, and I am research professor here at Bern University of the Arts, working also in the Department of History of Art, University College London. After our successful colloquium, Performance, the Ethics and the Politics of Care, which took place only 10 days ago, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce the next in our series of events, a panel titled Living Materials, Ethics and Principles for Embodied Stewardship, which has a conversational format and which will be led by Megan Metcalf and Cori Olinghouse. I'm greeting everyone also on behalf of my colleagues and core members of our research team, postdoctoral fellow Julia Pelta-Feldman.
Hello.
Emily Magnan, a doctoral candidate on the project.
Hi.
Our artistic collaborator, performance artist and HKB professor, Valerian Male. He has the camera turned off, but I bet he's greeting us from behind the scene.
Sorry, yes.
Wonderful.
Okay.
The team of the project and of this panel came together due to a generous funding of the Swiss National Science Foundation and was made possible due to the continuing support of the Research Division and the Department of Materiality in Art and Culture at Bern University of the Arts. Unlike the colloquium, this event is taking part within a series of Donnerstag-Vorträge. That's a Thursday lecture, and is supported by the HKB Department of Materiality in Art and Culture, headed by Sebastian Dobruski. A few words about the project before we begin. Performance, conservation, materiality knowledge applies the theoretical practical apparatus of conservation to examine performance and performance-based works as a part of our culture, as forms changing and enduring in a network of people and things. In this project, we switch the lens of performance from the established debates in performance studies, art history, heritage studies, and anthropology to the lens of conservation to consider and debate performance as a necessarily conservable form. We situate conservation as a disciplinary formation whose knowledge and practices not only grant us an unprecedented access to the knowledge about, in, and of performance, its ontological and epistemic status, its temporal and spatial attributes, and its social, museological, and institutional embeddedness, but they also provide a valuable contribution to other humanities disciplines, expanding knowledge about performance, its making and remaking, its distribution and display, its life and afterlife as an act, flesh, gesture, document, residue, or detritus. And here is where the topic of today's panel or conversation perfectly fits in. This conversation between artist and archivist Cori Olinghouse and art historian Megan Metcalf examines embodied conservation skills, which are essential for the preservation of performance and related mediums, yet remained mostly invisible and under-theorized in visual art. Their presentation will begin from the premise that dance and other performance forms have inherent strategies for continuation that mitigate against their assumed ephemerality. The speakers will lay out paradigms from dance and improvisation for originality, authorship, and continuity that are at odds with those of object conservation. This sets up an exploration of the care of live art and museums, at museums and beyond institutions through a mutual interview focused on each speaker's experience with translating dance and performance works for the present and future. Now, Megan Metcalf is an art and dance historian who brings a practitioner's perspective to scholarly research, combining work in institutional and personal archives with a background in dance and choreography. She received her PhD in contemporary art history from the University of California in Los Angeles in 2018 and has held positions at institutions including Art Center College of Art and Design in Pasadena, Otis Center College of Art and Design, the Getty Research Institute, and UCLA, all in Los Angeles. Her work has been published by the Bard Graduate Center in New York, Dance Space Project in New York, and Open Space at SF MoMA, and supported by the New York Public Library and the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation, among others. She's currently at work on a book about the history of dance and performance in art museums, and a few insights into her thoughts already promise a wonderful, wonderful project, and we much look forward to reading it. Now, Cori Olinghouse comes to this work from multiple perspectives as an artist, performer, restager, archivist, and curator. In 2017, she founded The Portal, an artist-led initiative that cultivates archiving as a poetic and performative practice. Recently, she collaborated with the Studio Museum in Harlem on the acquisition and restaging of Autumn Night's performance work Wall, the first performance to enter the permanent collection. Formerly, as archive director for the Trisha Brown Dance Company, she collaborated with David Thompson on an audiovisual database that tracks Brown's development of a lexicon of movement, mapping her choreographic ideas and methods into a vocabulary that can be further researched and accessed. She holds an MA in performance curation from Wesleyan University and serves as a visiting faculty at the Center for Curatorial Studies at Bard College. Megan and Cori, really warm welcome. And before I will hand over, just a quick overview of our schedule. So the conversation between Megan and Cori will take around 45-50 minutes and will be followed by a Q&A. So please, now to the audiences, our audiences, please save your questions for this part of our panel. We will conclude the panel at 6:55 Zurich time. Now, wishing us all a wonderful event, I'm handing over to Megan and Cori.
Thank you so much, Hannah. We're talking today about the complexities of property, stewardship, and the colonial structures of the museum. And as part of that, I need to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the unceded land of the Tongva people, which is today Los Angeles, California. Thank you so much, Hannah, for inviting us, and to all of your collaborators for organizing this. It feels wonderful to be a part of this and to bring our ongoing dialogue into this framework. So Cori, we just got a lot of details about your bio and your introduction, but I just wanted to add a couple to introduce you. I have learned so much from you about the kinds and quality of embodied knowledge in my own research as an art historian. Your work is exemplary in how it listens to artists and artworks, modeling a generative conservation that is really at the forefront of the field. As Hannah mentioned, you've been working in artist archives since 2001 and also danced with the Trisha Brown Company and transitioned to the archive director. Since then, or as part of that too, you've worked with dance companies, individual artists, and others on documentation, archiving, and continuation projects as what you've sometimes called an embodied reconstructor. And you've had this role in museums as a translation person for museums. But you also maintain a creative practice that's based in postmodern dance, somatics, humor-based work, and social dance. And this is where I feel the heart of your work is in this capability to talk artist to artist and to maintain flexibility and creativity as well as a lot of joy in this work. So I hope we'll get to uncover that today as we talk. Yeah, thank you so much for doing this with me, Cori.
Thank you so much, Megan. And thank you also to Hannah and to all of your research collaborators. It's really a pleasure to be able to talk about these ideas. And I wanted to just say that I'm calling in from the unceded land of the Lenape Hoking, currently known as Brooklyn, New York. And we pay respect to the Lenape land, water, and ancestors past, present, and future. And for those who are joining us, thank you so much for your attention during an immense time of Zoom fatigue. And so feel free to make yourselves comfortable during the conversation if you need to lie down, stretch, eat, or take breaks whenever you need. So Megan, I'm going to throw it over to you.
Yeah.
Wait, I'm
good.
Yeah. So you're an art historian, art and dance historian, studying the work that I'm doing. And it's been so moving to be in conversation with you around this shared terrain that we both inhabit in really different ways. And I'm really moved in your writing and scholarship with the ways you insist that performance practices carry their own forms of knowing and transmission. And I love this quote where you write, dance operates more like an epistemology than a physical thing. It's a way of knowing rather than a fixed object. And I feel that spirit is so alive in your work. In your forthcoming book, I love the ways you're uncovering some of the hidden logics that go into the ways museums are collecting performance. Given that there hasn't been extensive writing published around this area, your scholarship is making these examples more publicly transparent and accessible by way of helping to extend and expand innovations in this field. You speak vividly to the way performance conservation is inherently social and collaborative, tracing the interacting ecosystem of multiple players, the artists, embodied practitioners, archivists, curators, scholars, security guards, museum staff, and shifting publics. Whereas a lot of other writing in this field is coming through a time-based media conservation lens, who are working with variable media of new media works and applying this to the discipline of performance. Your writing brings a precision to existing models of transmission in dance and performance. And so I'm so happy to be here with you, and I'm gonna hand it back to you.
Yeah, well, our conversation today is structured kind of just to invite this audience into our ongoing dialogue, where we're like sharing ideas about our own work. And in which we've noticed a lot of things about like how the writing is about this kind of work and where the conversation is. In our respective practices, like me, history and theory, and you in practice, and obviously we're both practicing and theorizing along with that all the time anyway, we've noticed that this phrase, this idea of quote unquote body-to-body transmission is increasingly invoked by museums and in conservators and curators. But the how of that is not often addressed. And that's the stuff that we feel really intimately involved in. One thing that you've written that I feel like is at the heart of our objective today, or one of our objectives today, you say it's essential to be able to qualitatively understand how transmission is taking place, which means attuning to the memory structures that underlie particular forms. And that attuning is something I find so compelling about your work. I want to jump into a project you did with the Trisha Brown Dance Company. But first, I want to note, my deep respect for the female identified artists that we're talking about today. And also that we'll probably talk about them using their first names, which is a measure of the intimacy that we've had working with them, that this work requires. So I'll probably use Simone and you'll probably use Trisha, and vice versa, right? This work, Pamplona Stones, I'm going to pull up my screen because we have some slides, was a work that was performed just a handful of times in the 1970s. And you collaborated with the Trisha Brown Dance Company in 2017, 2018, around there, to revive or reconstruct this piece. But it was pretty clear early on that that wasn't going to take, like the usual reconstruction process wasn't really going to work for this piece. And I'm hoping you can tell us more about that. And And I guess I'll supply a definition here. In a dance company, the repertory is the collection of dances that a dance company stewards or holds. And they're repeated year after year, or maybe skipping years, or revived after a few years, mostly by way of embodied knowledge transfer, like a kind of teaching. There's usually someone who's done the work who's teaching it to a new generation of dancers, passing down the choreography, which is like the sequence of steps, the movement patterns, the body shapes. That's the repertory that's held by a dance company. This had kind of, well, you can speak more specifically to it, but it like fallen out of repertory, or never really been part of the repertory of the company. Reconstruction of a dance sometimes happens if only fragments of it remain, or if it's been a long time since the work has been revived. And both of these processes, like just the regular repertory process, is aided by video or other recordings. Are we having a feedback issue?
It has been solved, Megan. You can continue.
Okay, great. Thank you. So anyway, this was, it was clear that it wasn't going to be a regular piece of repertory, and you got involved and from the very beginning you were involved, but will you talk about the steps involved in the process, and why was it clear that wasn't going to work, and just tell us more about this project.
Well, already, thank you so much, Megan. I feel like your distinctions around what perhaps a repertory reconstruction is already like pretty clear. So for Pamplona Stones, my intention was really to let humor be the guide. And for the jokes in the work to register, the performers would need to learn to follow their own amusements rather than performing the work as a kind of like abstract choreography. And so for me, like part of my job was to help them attune to listening to the rhythms and timings between the words, the actions, and the gestures. And so as part of starting the process, I had archival material to work from, but it was really important to me that I spend this immersive time with Sylvia Palacios Whitman, whose own relationship to humor in her performance artwork was so instrumental to the making of the work. So we spent a week together in a residency structured as a kind of like physicalized oral history process. And I also used Trisha's words as a blueprint or DNA for the work. So if you want to go to the next slide, Megan, it's maybe hard for viewers to make out, but I'll read some of the phrases here. Things like actions taken, reaction ignored, puns made, puns respun, placing things, placing words, moving around, redistributing, parts and things and words. And in another description, Trisha described this work as a careful distribution of words, objects, and gestures, an interplay of ambiguity in language and reference, a multiple theme and variations. So for me, in some ways, this document was really the most important. I mean, working with Sylvia Palacios Whitman was really the most important aspect. And then as a secondary step, using this as a kind of, as I basically used this document and the words derived from it as an improvisational score, as a way to kind of recover the associative logic and the humorful impulses in the work. And I guess what
can I jump in here and recap that the duet is a very like stripped down, like simple interaction between these two performers. And you said it's like negotiating these objects of words, physical things, and the space and each other. There's not like dancing in it in the sense of like elaborate choreography, but as you're saying, like your project is to mine the humor of it, not to like reproduce the shapes that they were making. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I think that that was the challenge of it, is in the end, I did have to adhere to the choreography, which included the shapes and gestures and included the script. But I knew that the only way that that would be animate was if the sort of syntax of the joke structure was alive in the ways that the performers could embody. And because so much of this work was really about Trisha and Sylvia's own personal relationship, you know, they raised their kids together, they had a life together, like as friends, in and out of the studio. And they're both incredibly witty, hilarious people. And they had this just incredibly easeful banter between friends. You know, that kind of thing is essentially impossible to reproduce. And I wasn't interested to try to have the performers somehow like mimicking or imitating Sylvia and Trisha, because so much of this came directly from their own personalities. So I think it became, you know, I really used improvisation as a way to try to like unearth or get underneath the sort of logic of the work to also help inscribe or embed or make that more like internal to the performer's own sensibility. And so, you know, one thing that I'll just say, like the space of language has become really important in the way that I reconstruct. And a lot of that is really derived from Trisha's own poetic use of language in her notebooks. And so I essentially used a kind of like spiral writing practice that I also transmitted to the performers. As a way to continue to kind of elicit like a thicker description and to like attune to the humor. And so some of the phrases we generated were things like deadpan, but without zombie, deadpan TV ritual, doing one action at a time, weird amounts of dead time, delayed reactions, all very anticlimactic. So we had to kind of, what I was trying to help the performers do was essentially internalize certain kind of grammars about the work, but from their own perspectives that includes really honoring their own agency and improvisational impulses. And we actually made quite a few versions of Pamplona Stones. There were our own versions. And so, yeah, I guess the other thing I'll just say is that I did do a lot of trial and error experiments with video documentation. And there's this really gorgeous video reference from the Walker in 1974. And, you know, I experimented actually with attempting to replicate this as choreographic grammar. And I mean, I felt like a clown when I was doing all of these experiments around Reconstruction as I was doing this project. And for me, like out of that, I found that in only trying to replicate the choreographic gestures, there was just like a flattening or deadening to the work. And especially because they're so stripped down and it's so kind of like elegantly deadpan, it's really easy to miss the tone of the way there's like a brightness and a sort of like pathos operating at the same time. And so anyway, out of that, I began to kind of jokingly refer to this process as dance forensics, like when you two myopically are trying to study the details in the video. Anyway, I know this is something we've talked a lot about, Megan, so I don't know if you want to say
It's so
anything.
funny to me. Yeah, I mean, I love this term that you've invented, dance forensics, because it really captures the way some of these reconstructions are done, where you're like making yourself over into the video, where you're like trying to make yourself into this image, and it usually consists of like a VCR on the rolly thing that comes into the studio, and then there's a lot of like pause and play, and it can be really precise. You were telling me that another collaborator you were working with was at one point like looking at the shadows to determine how many steps they had taken. Like it can get really, really precise. But the reason it's funny and the reason I love this term dance forensics is because ultimately that kind of precision doesn't usually end up in reproducing the work, right? It reproduces something else, or it reproduces the video or the documentation. It doesn't quite. And what I love about this project in particular is that, and your narration of your process is that you have to mine the humor and you have to like figure out what's driving that humor in order to give it life, to make it alive. I know as part of that process, you brought in a scientist of jokes. Will you talk a little bit about who the scientist of jokes is and what they do?
Yeah, totally. So I brought in a collaborator and friend of mine named Colin Gee, who's an incredible interdisciplinary artist working in performance and visual art, but who has a background going all the way back to like Commedia dell'arte and Lecoq and so on, and has developed this incredible somatic practice where essentially kind of borrowing from some of the languages from Commedia dell'arte, looks at the different body centers in clown or humor-based work in terms of how they're communicating or inflecting something about meaning. So in clown, a lot of times the higher class clowns really move from the head, and then melodrama often like happens from the chest, and then the bodier clowns are really who are motivated like appetite, which includes sex, money, etc., are really moving from the pelvis in a kind of bodier space. So Colin has kind of devised this incredible way of looking at how the spaces of the body can kind of orchestrate meaning without necessarily approaching it narratively, which is really important to the sort of non sequitur logic that both Sylvia and Trisha embody. And so anyway, out of that process, I recommended to the Trisha Brown Company that we film that process, just because I knew that this wasn't maybe the type of influence that would come up in a reconstruction process around this work later on. And so a lot of times what I'm trying to do in archives, I feel very much like a performer in the archive or like a ghost in the machine or something. I'm trying to kind of help also deposit things back into the archive to create more of like an active, essentially feedback loop between the creative practice of the work and the existing archive of the work. So anyway, so that is a document that now is this like enigmatic thing. People may not understand exactly what it is, but yeah.
That's wonderful. That's really great. So, and I feel like, or not, I feel like this is something we've talked about at length, where introducing this element of, so in this case, it's humor and the improvisation that was giving you the ability to create like a new version of this. And which speaks to this point that that we like joke about with dance forensics, but it's really an important point in this work that sometimes exactly reproducing something makes a dance or a performance into something else. And in order to keep something from transforming into something else, in fact, you maybe have to change it. You may have to introduce other like interpretive elements. Yeah, I don't know if you want to say anything more before we transition to our next thing.
Though it's very hard to achieve, which is essentially like how in any kind of preservation process, essentially like it's to avoid destroying dance's unruly impulses. And so, for me, I think every iteration in a performance is a different work, a different performance in some sense. So there's a very fine line of kind of balancing what are the like inherent details that make a work, and then how can it further like transmutate as a way that extends the life of the work. And so anyway, I know this is something you write about a lot, this space of interpretation in terms of Simone Forte's work Seesaw, which was included in MoMA's 2015 acquisition of the dance constructions. And so Megan, I would love if you could just talk a little bit more about this work and process.
Yeah, so I love that dance's inherent, did you say dance's inherent unruliness? Yeah, Seesaw was one of the 9 works that was collected by MoMA in 2015. And I was really fortunate to be able to, well, I started out as Simone's student in 2010, sorry. And then was really fortunate to witness this process up close and see a lot of different parts of it. And here is Simone in Salzburg in 2014 at her first major museum retrospective. And teaching Seesaw to, this is a work that she did initially or that she directed initially in 1960 with Robert Morris and Yvonne Rayner, who are here on the left. And this is her teaching it in 2014, and she's restaged it a few times. That's what you see here on the right in 2011. And I think initially her thinking about this work, I can't say what she was thinking, but from what I observed in this teaching process, she was maintaining a lot of the elements from the 1960 version. And here we see her developing the work, and the magazine is important because that was an element in the 1960 work. And I was able to observe her sort of backing up from that or letting go of that I didn't exactly need to reproduce the elements or even contain all those elements. In the case of the magazine, for some reason, it really wasn't working. This is Federico and Eliana, and they, all of them tried it a number of times and it really wasn't working. There were a number of other like contextual factors that ultimately led Simone to letting them really develop their own versions and letting them experiment. You know, the seesaw, the balance, the situation of the setup and the balance and the two performers was enough to provide a kind of framework in order to allow seesaw to like keep its identity, to keep its integrity as an artwork. So as this work is continued into the future, by the time she got to the 2015 acquisition, she was letting people direct it in their own way, letting Seesaw like transmute into other things. So here we see on the left a version that has 3 performers, and actually that's happened quite a bit since it's been in MoMA's collection. On the left, we see 3 performers doing it. And on the right, we see 2 performers with this huge thing of clay where they were like smashing it around the room and spreading it around. And it was really physical and embodied. And it became like another performer almost in this version. This one in 2019 was performed by Will Rawls and Andros Zinsbrown at MoMA as part of their exhibition about the Judson Dance Theater. This one took on issues having to do with immigration and borders. And so the ability of this work to, their ability to take it on and interpret the score how they saw it, really allowed them to connect it to current events, allowed them to connect it to issues that they saw as being really, really urgent. So, they also invited in a third collaborator who was translating their words into Spanish. A lot of the score that the improvisation that they developed had to do with talking out loud to Simone, letting her know how they had done this. It was very self-conscious about the fact that they were like changing this work and making it mean something else. At a certain point, they took this board off and were using it as kind of like a border wall, as like a way to corral people into like small spaces. And I think in this, like, they are able to capitalize or tap into that that wildness, the wildness in the work, or dance's inherent unruliness, and take it into being something new.
And you also, I remember you describing Simone as saying it's a kind of domestic drama that plays out, and wanting like intentionally choosing the transmitter to be a director, and that person could be another artist, and essentially having the agency to somewhat like remake the work. So I don't know if you have anything more to say about the domestic drama, or, I mean, another thing that I think quite a lot about in these projects is the way in which there are innumerable ways to structure the process of transmission. That body-to-body transmission is just too general of a kind of catch-all phrase. And here, like she's already sculpting how the work, like the work's futurity, and the way that it can be further interpreted by choosing that this person be in the role of a director. So I don't know if you have more to say about that.
Yeah, maybe it's somewhat. I mean, it's really open. She says it could be any kind of artist. It could be an architect. It could be a sculptor. In this case, they're both choreographers. Yeah, it's really open in that regard. And the thing she specifies is that they have a strong creative vision. And I find that so inspiring, because it just like recognizes that somebody in the future might have something more to say with the work, or might be able to yeah, it seems like she really trusts the work, that it'll maintain its integrity because of that structure, the physical structure. And then it's like she believes enough in its own power to create a narrative, and its own power to create like a physical events that she's sort of letting it loose in the world. I guess one thing I want to return to also is that in my own observation of this process, Simone, these works have some elements of improvisation in them, but they're actually quite restrictive in terms of their choreography and their steps. They don't have choreography strictly speaking, but they're like very tight, and they're very object-like, which is one reason why they were easy to collect, or seemed appropriate to collect by museum. But the rest of her career has been mostly improvisation, and it felt like observing this process, she was figuring things out on the ground, and this is one element of the process where I observed her teaching it like repertory in the beginning, and then departing from that made it really clear to me that this stuff was being worked out on the ground. And there were surprises in store, and Seesaw being able to be taken on by another director is sort of enacts one of those surprises.
That's amazing. Yeah, I very much love, I think when you're thinking inside of improvisational systems, you understand that there's a kind of like sociality or social network to what's happening, and these like multiple layers or valences of listening. And also there's an understanding that form is very much alive, and that the complexity of form and all of these kind of drafts and sketches and iterations that, she moves through over time are part of the language of this piece as it continues to like shapeshift and evolve. And so I think there's a lot that the field of conservation can learn from improvisational systems. And it seems really beautiful that both of us have that background, and also have been drawn to artists that are like really deeply embedded in improvisation too.
Yeah, and as I was getting ready this morning, I was thinking like, Trisha herself has like some very beautiful words about the structures that are very deep in improvisation. That word often invokes like, oh, do whatever you want, but actually there's really deep structure in it, which is I know what we've been talking about, but what drives the creativity in these projects, what drives their ability to stay alive. And I know that attuning to both the sociality and the wildness and unruliness was something you also had to do with the Studio Museum's first acquisition of performance. That's Autumn Night's Wall. Will you describe that process and your role in it?
Yeah. So first, I just want to say that Autumn Night is an artist I have tremendous respect for. And we both share a relationship to performance through humor-based practices and also through improvisation. And Autumn's an interdisciplinary artist who's practicing across performance, text, video, installation, and really brings a kind of lens to her work through a background in drama therapy. And where often like she has the capacity to kind of shape social spaces through this like participatory lens. So anyway, she had participated as an artist in residence at the Studio Museum in Harlem from 2016 to 17. And at the end of their residency periods, they asked each artist to contribute a work for their permanent collection. And Autumn was basically like, I work in performance. So, you know, requested that they collect for the first time a work in that discipline. And that conversation went on for a couple years before I was essentially brought in. And, you know, I think Autumn expressed to the Studio Museum that she really wanted a collaborator to work with who was familiar with dramaturgy, choreography, embodied practices, but also knowing how to navigate the museum, like knowing how to navigate conservation issues around performance archiving and acquisition. So I essentially joined the project in that capacity. And I helped the Studio Museum not only kind of think about their infrastructure around what it means to be collecting performance, but I also collaborated on contextual documentation. And I also assisted with the restaging of this work, which is pictured here, at Dance Space Project in 2019. And I guess just like a couple of things that I'd love to share about this process is that they're really distinct from the process that you've written so beautifully about in terms of Simone, is that Autumn was not coming to this institutional project as a late stage career artist, where much had already been documented, or where a whole kind of pedagogy or teaching or articulation had already been described around this particular work. You know, many of us in New York had never seen the work live. It had been previously performed as part of her Galveston art residency in 2014, which was a different iteration, and then also in Houston at the Contemporary Art Museum in 2016. So by the time Autumn and I started working together, you know, she said to me, I've never really been asked to talk much about this work. And I think was also still really interested in the work's continued creative development. And so, you know, for me, I think there's really different kinds of inquiry or research that is required when an artist is still involved in a kind of state of becoming around what the work is. And so for me, my role is often to be deeply immersed in an artist's creative process. And, you know, by part of kind of excavating the details of the work and the concepts and embodied languages inherent in the work, I really wanted to avoid just handing Autumn a bunch of artist questionnaires. Not that those kinds of guides are not useful by way of kind of laying the ground or creating a kind of fourth dimensional picture of what needs to be thought about. But I knew that there was that much of like the work's intelligence was in a kind of deeply internalized nonverbal state, and that, you know, it was going to require some call and response dialogue between the two of us to really start to like map this out on paper in a way that also wouldn't calcify or deaden its own logics.
Like,
so
you definitely couldn't get into dance forensics here. Like, there wasn't going to be. It's a very simple work, right? I mean, it's very complex and deep, but it's like choreographically very. So that the meaning isn't in any kind of steps or poses or like rhythms or shapes. Yeah. Is that right?
Yeah, essentially, like what she does in each location in this work is she brings together an intergenerational cast of Black femme participants. It's really important for Autumn that there are multiple senses of lived time in the room. So I think the youngest person in this work was 15, and it went all the way up to 70 years old. And, you know, in terms of Black history, it was really important for her to have that kind of embodied lived time in the room. And also, you know, I had to really make sure, especially coming from my background as a white postmodern practitioner and performer, really not to treat the work as a choreographic object. It was really important for me to understand that the work is a performance work and a form of social action. And so I had to kind of understand the grammar of like how Autumn is working with the participants and how she's creating this social space of care, which is essentially what the work is really about. And she walks down the wall with each participant, and using her kind of drama therapy background, essentially helps to identify in this nonverbal call and response process what she calls each person's unconscious gesture. And she's looking for a way for that person to be able to kind of in a durational work, move through whatever that unconscious gesture is, where it's comfortable and they could repeat it for 45 minutes and so forth. And so there's a lot of like listening that happens in the work. And a lot of what I did through, again, a kind of like embodied oral history process was to really try to get at how Autumn is intuitively creating that scenario where she can uncover the participants' unconscious gestures. And anyway, we made all of these incredible discoveries that there's not a lot of time to talk about, but one of them was I used the word telescoping. And what we started to understand is that, and I'm going to paraphrase this possibly badly, but in drama therapy, there's a term called over-distancing or under-distancing. And as a practitioner, you learn how to work with the person in front of you to help either break down a wall or to kind of create more of a boundary based on how much information or intimacy somebody is like enabling or not enabling. So there are all of these like very complex details to how Autumn sculpts these social spaces and really leads from a space of care. And so anyway, again, attuning to like what the memory structures are in the work, a big part of the labor was just to try to wrap our heads around what was happening, knowing that in the future it may not be Autumn doing that process. There's so much I would say, but
yeah. So you basically, just in this one example, you basically worked in this really close, intimate process to sort of discover additional things about the form of the work, about both its creation and its eventual manifestation. In a way, like doing a kind of documentation of it, all of which sort of had to have, like, if a museum is going to collect a performance, they have to like understand what they're collecting. And it sounds like those were major discoveries made in the process of defining what this work is, that maybe Autumn hadn't realized herself in the creation of it.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think in the spirit that the kind of archiving of this work needs to be in an active feedback loop with the creative development of the work itself. I think that's the lens that like I could bring to this project. Yeah. And I will say that the documentation isn't just about taking photographs and taking video. It's really about, for me, like understanding as somebody who's also performed a lot of historical works, that certain kinds of documents act as a kind of retrieval system for the senses and mean something to the nervous system, even in the texture of the words or the poetics or the language. And so I was really looking at, in some ways I really learned a lot of this from Trisha Brown's own documentation processes, but it was essentially, and Autumn had a lot to say about that. She was like, I want the script to tell stories. I want to use Malcolm X's idea of like, keep making the language, keeping it plain. And so there was a whole like artistic collaborative way that we also approached the documentation. And part of it was also thinking of those documents as an extension of transmission. So yeah, we did a whole process that I called visual mapping, which is essentially sketching out the elements of the wall. And we laid out this like long roll of paper and we spent, 2 days like mapping out really like Autumn moving through a stream of conscious kind of improvisational practice to lay out the compositional structure, the concepts, and the embodied details of the work. And then from there, I would ask her to talk about each of those elements. And we recorded all of those as audio files and I later transcribed them. So now there's around like 4 edited transcriptions of our kind of like 3-month process from that work. And, one of the things that I did is before we came back together after the work had been restaged at Dance Space Project, this was all happening simultaneously also. And we came back together with the Studio Museum in Harlem. I asked all of the conservators and curators to listen to those transcripts. And, knowing it was a lot of labor, like a lot of material to sit through. But what was really, really beautiful is what was transmitted through those conversations really helped inform like a deeper picture of the work. And these ideas of like elasticity and call and response. And what Autumn also talks about is like wanting the work to be modular in the future, really informed also the structure of how we started to like think about the acquisition. So, and I think that's something for me where often I'm looking for the form of the archive or the kind of structure, how the framework of an acquisition is structured to have some like kinship or to mirror the way an artist is actually working. And I think the challenge of that is that it means that there really is no one size fits all, that like this has to be an immersive, embodied, improvisational process with each artist potentially.
Yeah, yeah. We have one more example that really extends that logic, but I want to make sure that we are able to get to our audience's questions. Do you think maybe we can get to, well, let's try to get to our last example, maybe in our conclusions or after the questions. Does that sound good?
That sounds good.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. Oh no, actually I'll leave it up in case we need to return. Yeah, we'll pause there, take some questions, and then we'll come back for some, I don't know, conclusions or bullet points or synthesis at the end. But yeah, that's I feel like that's a good place to stop.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I was really also looking forward to the huddle already, but obviously a wonderful idea to involve our audiences to ask questions. I see one of them already in our Q&A, but perhaps I just allow myself to ask a question which is perhaps a little bit general, although I am also interested in the way that Cori just spoke about documentation, that it's not only, you know, kind of manifest in the video or an image. And I'm thinking here about Rebecca Schneider's also kind of idea about other forms, you know, of documenting in a way, or how, yeah, perhaps another performance might become a document of an initial performance or something along those lines. But let me ask you the general question first, perhaps. You know, you mentioned before, and I think this comes from Megan's writing, that dance is a form of knowledge that operates as an epistemic practice, I think, as a way of knowing rather than an object. And you elaborated on it a little bit in your conversation on examples. But I like to know, you know, whether dance as a way of knowing is kind of intrinsically bound to institutions, no, where certain forms of knowledge, transmission and continuity are perhaps enabled or are possible, no? And what happens outside, in a way, of those institutions, outside the canon, or in case of dance practices, perhaps taking place on the margins? Perhaps you could say a little bit on this topic. Thank you.
Let me make sure I understand the question. The question is like, how is dance or other performance like institutionally marked? Is that what you're asking?
Wait, let me see. I'm unmuted. Yes, actually, I was thinking about how those transmission of knowledge, happens outside of this perhaps larger institutions that have, certain frames of possibilities that perhaps other settings do not have, or practices happening on the margins perhaps have in a different way. Yeah, but obviously not the same.
I have a lot of thoughts about this. I mean, I think in some ways for me, it's like inverting the question around what does it mean for a museum to acquire performance? And it's more about like, how can the museum learn from performance's own inherently complex structures? I know specifically with Autumn Night, like a lot of her performance work does interrogate infrastructure. She just did an incredible month-long residency a couple months after the COVID shutdown at the kitchen, where she essentially inhabited the kitchen's building and kind of called it as like remaking, let's see, how did she phrase it? I'm gonna miss this, but was essentially like maintaining the building through performance. And I think in addition, what was required in Wall by way of having to like expand the institutional infrastructure, I think is like where, so anyway, I think that there's a lot of possibility to be looking the other direction instead of like, how can museums take? It's more like, how can museums expand their infrastructures to be more plastic and mutable the way performance is? But I also think, I mean, for me, a lot of the a lot of the like thinking that kind of undergirds what I do is really based on really deep improvisational research and study that I've done inside of social dance forms. And I think in part because there's a different structure of ownership, you know, a form like voguing is not owned by a single person. And also because for those works to like maintain their life, or those performance forms, in order for them to maintain their liveness, they're constantly like transmuting and shapeshifting over time. And I think voguing is a perfect example where like in the 80s, we're really seeing old way vogue, which is, you know, very like military and geometric and shapes. And then more recently, you know, we're seeing new wave vogue, which starts to involve like a different kind of like contortion and polyrhythm and like arm clicking but they share a kind of like DNA, and part of the DNA they share is a sort of social responsibility for how the performance forms are like actively policed within a community, but also challenged and extended. So for me, like, I think there's quite a lot to learn from call and response forms emerging out of Black practice. And I think that's something that, you know, I really appreciated that Rebecca Schneider also really spoke to. And I don't know, Megan, if you have like further thoughts about that as well.
I agree. I mean, you said like the institution turning outward and expanding its borders. Also, there's a way that, and this was called for at the end of the symposium last time, as conservation is thinking about, or is just going to transform into like a generative practice or even a performance practice. Like part of that is like listening and learning, and like you're saying, the ability to sort of take in lessons and ancestral knowledge from both like intangible cultural heritage, but also long-standing performance forms like dance. Jokingly, I'll say sometimes like, well, ballet has been around for like hundreds of years, and it has managed to like stay without any museums. Like people have managed to make that work, and even further, like there are folk dances, and you're talking about, you know, like 20th century social forms, but those have roots, you know, going back even much further. So and
I think especially because like so many of the examples that we've talked about that have a like historical precedent inside of like a museum's collection are Western forms, and they are also like white postmodern forms. I think, you know, we have to be really careful as practitioners not to like only lead from that particular perspective, because so much of where performance drives its intelligences are through like deeper histories of orality and transmission and ritual and storytelling. So, and I feel like, anyway,
where objects and where you know, written records were foreclosed for many reasons.
Right. I also feel like, Megan, I don't know if this is the place, but I feel like Simone Forte's Huddle really continues a kind of social model and rewrites a little bit terms of ownership. I don't know if now is a good time to share a little bit about that.
Well, we might as well. Yeah. So this is Simone Forte's Huddle, which is something that really exemplifies the way that dance is a way of knowing and a fixed thing. It does both things at the same time. It's an object that's made by people climbing over it, and the supporters constantly shifting to support the climber. And this was included as part of the acquisition, but from the very beginning, Simone insisted that no one could exclusively own this, that it had circulated for so long in the dance community, that its knowledge is easily transmissible, and there's a value in transmitting it outside of institutional structures. The acquisition would have to contend with this idea that had been shared for so long, it couldn't be exclusive property. And so ultimately the acquisition, this was a major point of just trying to figure out how to do this. Ultimately the acquisition allows for Huddle to take place in informal context, so that practitioners are also stewards of the work in addition to MoMA. And you can imagine a situation where they have to work together. You can imagine a situation where for whatever reason, Huddle doesn't get shown for a really long time, but it can still live on in the dance practices of practitioners. And there's evidence that that's happening since the acquisition. And also you can imagine that like MoMA will also help as it keeps the documentation, as it keeps the histories of it. It will help maintain it as well. So it'll help the community have an example. Every time it trains teachers or it trains performers, those performers can take it and share it with their own communities as a way to enact collective care in that regard. So the two stewards ultimately have to work together. Right. This is some of the evidence that it's happening is, where you can find these on the internet.
It's really beautiful.
Yeah.
So are you ready for some more questions?
Yeah.
I wonder if I might ask something that I've been thinking about since the beginning of your talk, when you were talking about Pamplona stones and the importance of the personal relationship and the specificity of those two performers. And it's a question that in our project we find ourselves asking a lot. What does it mean to preserve a work that is tied to a specific body or specific bodies? And Cori, you spoke really, really thoughtfully and engagingly about one kind of approach to that. So I'm curious what you both have to say about this question of detaching a work from the specific bodies that were originally associated with it, while somehow holding on to the personalities or the individuals, their presence that are crucial to the work, and without which that work would cease to be what it is.
Megan, do you want to start first, since I was speaking a little too much?
Oh, you're not speaking too much at all. I had a thought while you were speaking, and then I was like, oh, the thought is, yeah, in dance like, and I'm speaking about dance. I also work on lots of different kinds of performance, but dance is one of the ones that, because it can be repeated and because it does have a choreography, that it has these logics built into it over a long time. Also, that's my background and everything. But in dance, like, that you're gonna lose it. So like, there's not as much angst around that in some ways. Like, and there's like a deep reverence for the people who've originated certain roles. And part of that is part of the institutional and collective knowledge, like which roles can be re-inhabited and which roles are forever gone. And I think Pamplona Stones is a really great example, because this one hadn't been reconstructed in any way, right, Cori, with the Trisha Brown Dance Company as repertory. And that was exactly the issue, was like, how could you, like, there's a collective knowledge that no, Trisha and Sylvia's chemistry can't be reproduced. But then which is what lends itself to this approach that's mining for the deep structures, that's mining for the humor structures and improvisation structures. But ultimately, I think some of those decisions, if not made by the artist, or helped to be made by the artist's community, whether certain roles can be inhabited again later, like Martha Graham's roles are, like, in a modern dance paradigm, those are transformed. I remember in my research, very early on in my research into the Bruce Cunningham Dance Company, there were certain roles that nobody had ever taken until a certain dancer came along, and the custodians of that work, or maybe even it was Merce himself, were like, oh, this person can do that. So I don't know if that answers your question, but hopefully it starts to.
No, those are no, thank you. And those are really, really great and rich examples. And it's interesting what you're saying, that sometimes I think it's easy for me to forget anyway, that the fact that a work could, as you say, a role could potentially be re-inhabited doesn't mean that it can be re-inhabited by anyone. But there's a big gap, or rather there's a lot of space between anyone and no one. And that you're kind of playing in that space. So let's see.
Yeah.
Can I add one little tiny thing too? Is that in some, especially in like visual art performance, and I don't see those things as always super distinct, but especially in visual art performance, like a certain artist or person's identity is extremely important to the performance work, and that sometimes will distinguish it from a dance work where like roles can be shared and inhabited. Whereas like if, let's say, Marina Abramovich like absolutely has to be doing that, like it's about being Marina Abramovich, and in fact that was a lot of the controversy or discussion that arose from her 2011 exhibition, is making the performance over into something more choreographic. Like, does it totally lose what it was important about it in the first place? And so maybe Abramovich isn't the greatest example, but when there is somebody where like the identity factors are really specific, and sometimes that has to do with cultural identity, racial identity, class identity, gender or sexuality identity, like those are a big part of it as well. And sometimes like the answer is no, it can't be inhabited by somebody else, I think. Yeah. Sorry, Cori, what were you gonna say?
Well, I was just gonna say that in some ways I kind of look at this in terms of looking at dance specifically. I think that works are tied to the specificity of the performers. And I think for me, there is always like an inherent failure, especially with this work, Pamplona Stones, in trying to kind of revisit the work. And I think for me, I try to like take up that space of failure as a generative space. And I think why I tried to make the distinction of like me not approaching the performers and trying to have them replicate Sylvia and Trisha's like mannerisms and gestures as kind of choreographic form was essentially to avoid turning them as performers also into objects. And so for me, like it's like having an underlying methodology that helps to like trigger or stay attuned to the wildness in the work. And for me, there's something that composer Pauline Oliveros shares that I really love, where she describes quantum performance as always being a composer, a player, and a listener simultaneously. And I think when I'm directing performers, I'm trying to like help them inhabit that kind of sensibility. Because when they're actively composing, even if they're moving through the kind of rote choreography or script or details of the work, if they're inhabiting it as an improviser or as a composer and as a player and listening to one another simultaneously, there's already a very different animate sense to what's happening than if they're just trying to replicate something they've seen on a video.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, so let's have a look. I don't know if you all if you both have a preference for the questions that we have, but we have a question quite early on about Cori's compelling practice of depositing things back into the archive. The question is, I wonder how this squares with conservation's mandate of reversibility. How does reversibility apply to dance and to performance?
I would love if somebody could actually talk to me a little bit about what the mandate of reversibility is.
Learning in public.
The very basic principle, and Hanna will correct me if I'm wrong, is that for example, if you're a conservator working on a painting, you don't want to do most of the time you want to avoid doing anything to that painting that can't be changed later. Although there are exceptions.
It's a very tricky question to ask, but it's an interesting one because one can understand the, reversibility in an expanded term, and this is perhaps where you could tell us something, on the basis of your knowledge about bends.
Does this also potentially have to do with attempting a kind of like minimal invasiveness?
Yes. Well, minimal intervention hangs with reversibility together in a way. It's one of the paradigms of traditional conservation, which have been, very much questioned in recent theory. But I think, the idea of reversibility might actually be very interesting to think about in relation to the archive and this depositing back or, sourcing from, I think, reversibility as recursibility or recursiveness, perhaps, or so. But I leave it to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really beautiful question. And I will say that this is one aspect in my practice that I'm critiqued around quite a lot. Because I am adding a lot of interpretation to the works by way of like revisiting and reimagining them. I think for me, the way performance is maybe operating a little bit differently than kind of thinking of a painting or another object-derived work, is that performance is already inherently unstable and inherently like shape-shifting with each iteration, no matter what. And I think for me, it's just about being conscious about one's own like subjectivity or interpretation that's being added back into the work, rather than kind of assuming that there's like a supposed neutrality, which just like really doesn't happen with performance. So for me, like I always think of this work as relational and intimate. And I often like think of the word regenerative. I think that's what I'm attempting in terms of like an art, and in terms of what then happens to the archive from the performance or from the reimagining of the performance. It's also understanding, and this really to me relates a lot to my interest in Rebecca Schneider's work, is that knowing that a lot of the like memory intelligences and embodied knowledge formations inside of performance don't live in written objects and documents. And so it's like there needs to be a kind of creative exploration around just documentation practices in general. So sometimes there's not material from the past to rely on. There has to be something new that's generated. And so for me, like I'm thinking of this very much as a living archive structure that is open-ended, adaptive, responsive, modular, and where rather than kind of having like a fixity, there's something fluid about how memory is being captured over time. And so I often am like looking, with Autumn Night, we looked at all of the pre-existing documentation from the other iterations. We looked back at her notes, we looked at everything that existed, but we were also newly generating material that would then live in the Studio Museum's collection as part of this iteration. So it's, again, that's why I really draw from improvisation frameworks. I hope that's helpful.
And I want to jump in here to say that like that's where also I feel like my job is as a historian, is to like also be a steward of the whole situation. So like acknowledging my own subjectivity as part of that, but also the subjectivities of the people who are involved. So in your introduction, Cori, you were saying that like the people that I'll go to talk to about artworks like is very expanded, and understanding its social life as very expanded. I feel like sort of goes hand in hand with that there's a documentation of the documentation. And yeah, it seems like so much work, but also starting from the place that like failure and loss are generative, rather than destroying the project, rather than making the project impossible, is the place that both of us, I think, are starting from. It's kind of a problem of too little and too much, and negotiating those two things at the same time is, for me, like where the interest is in the work. And I will say that Natalie's second part of her question said, based on what you've both said so far, I gather then maybe the concept of reversibility is irrelevant or impossible, maybe even undesirable, which sort of speaks to what we were just saying, that with performance art. So that starting in this place of failure or difficulty acknowledges that, but also, and Cori, you're not advocating for taking anything away necessarily. It's more like adding on.
So do you two have conclusionary remarks you want to move to, or do you have time for another question or two?
I feel like another question or two instead of trying to sum things up. But what do you think, Megan?
Well, I see a question here. Isn't reversibility more precisely that your intervention can be undone? I think, is that what was said? Maybe.
Does this question relate to conservation theory? Because in these terms, Barbara Appelbaum, for instance, talks about reversibility. So there are, this term is multivalent. I just want to say, you can apply it both to the substance, apply to the object, but also to the action of the treatment. And it's very kind of paradoxical, because one cannot actually reverse neither the treatment nor the substance can be kind of reversed fully. So it has been criticized and changed, but I think you very beautifully answered it already. The one here about from Taylor Healy, perhaps, thank you for this thought-provoking decision. Are there any examples that come to mind when you were talking about how sometimes exactly performing a work turns it into something else, where an exact reactivation of a performance prevents unruly parts that are inherent to the medium, perhaps in the last minute before your conclusions, Megan and Cori?
We had an example that was in here. That's an example that's put forward a lot. And this isn't, I think this answers this question. And so I don't have a slide of it. Yvonne Rainer's Trio A was recorded in 1978. It was a 1966 work that had actually a number of iterations before that 66 version was landed on. It was recorded with Yvonne herself doing it in 78 by a dance historian and a photographer who was really familiar with doing photography of dance. And that work has circulated sort of as the dance itself. It did for many years. And she had stopped dancing at that point. She brought it out to teach it as a historical object. But that 1978 video has been collected by museums, and more importantly, it's been taken on by people who just look at the video and learn the dance, and doing a kind of dance forensics in that regard. And Yvonne herself has very strongly resisted that, has tried to get that video off of YouTube at points, but also really insists that the work has to be transmitted in a live transmission process, that if you've learned it from the video, what you have learned is not Trio A, that you've learned something else that is not. And I think for her, the wildness of Trio A is in its exact precision. It's in the shifts of weight. I learned it over 10 weeks. She's allowed people to look. She has a stable of what she calls transmitters. There's 6 to 7 people who are able now to transmit it to other people. But I think for her, if you've done just the making yourself over into an image, then it's not actually the dance. So that's one example I can think of.
There's also a beautiful example just in humor work, where I was working with Bill Irwin, who's an incredible American theatrical actor and clown who's coming out of eccentric dance and in the American silent clown tradition. And he often says, if you're a performer and you're holding your breath as a comedian, the audience is going to go like this. And so some of this is also just understanding the deeply intersubjective, intercorporeal way that performance operates as a performer. And you learn, if you're attuning to it, you start to have skills for identifying if you're kind of deadening something. And some of it is somatic and sensorial too.
Yeah, okay, so maybe, so I guess we do have like some, I'll make some synthetic points, I guess. It's intersubjective, you have to pay attention to your audience. But the recommendations or the like synthesis that I'd like to offer is, you know, all of the stuff we've talked about is very process based, and it's very artist driven. It's dialogic in the sense that it's really listening to the work, it's listening to the work's community, it's listening to the artist as well, if that's possible. I feel like this sort of picks up exactly on the generative conservation call that was put out at the end of last week's symposium, and provides us some examples of how conservation can be redistributive, how it can work through networks of broader people. I think if there's like any kind of recommendation that we'd like to supply, it feels really important that embodied practitioners be involved in the process. Not all embodied knowledge is the same, and not all skills and intelligences are the same. So identifying that an embodied knowledge practitioner maybe needs to be involved is one step, and then identifying like what kind is also really important. And I from my own work, I also want to emphasize that embodied knowledge is also held within institutional memory, and sometimes I think that's kind of downplayed. If we're talking about needing to learn the physicality that's inherent to a work, like some of the people, the preparators or the invigilators or the people who are in the gallery with works that aren't performances, have a lot of physical knowledge about those works that maybe is overlooked in some conservation processes and curatorial processes. Acknowledging the social, I guess I've said this to a certain extent, but acknowledging the social material out of which performances are made is acknowledging the work's larger community, which could include like an institutional community as well. And it was really obvious in Wall and Huddle that those works have really specific communities. They are about communities. So the care of those works would include that community. And then I guess we've also talked about that regenerative or generative performance stewardship is happening, and it's happening all over the place. And part of the task is to recognize it and learn from it, I guess, right? In the way that institutions can expand out in order to learn those things. Cori, do you have any final thoughts?
I think the final thoughts I have are tied more to specific examples, but one thing I would just love to add about this question of interpretation and the sort of ethics around it is that for me, I think as long as the interpretation is attributed, I think that creates a clarity around the like artist, you know, the artist's authorship and other people that are reimagining it. So one example, in the Trish Brown database that I worked on with David Thompson, part of what we did is we transcribed, essentially, we created these maps of searchable content that transcribed Carolyn Lucas's notes that she kept as Trisha's choreographic assistant for over 30 years. And there were certain names that were given to different sections and phrase materials in the work that can be searched in the video content. And we added a field that we called naming provenance that just said Carolyn Lucas. So it was very clear that there was no confusion that those notes or those names didn't necessarily come directly from Trisha. So I think for me, like that's one way, and I think that's something that social dance forms, again, like really embody and acknowledge is like a performance form's own lineage and who the multiple people are who've been part of extending that lineage. So I think attribution is just like another thing I'd love to offer. And there's so many more thoughts, but I think we are maybe at time, so.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think, you know, there are really some excellent comments and two more questions in the chat and two more questions in the Q&A, which we will just allow ourselves to to save and forward to you after this seminar for your discretion, whether you would like to respond to them afterwards or not. But it has been really absolutely thought-provoking and inspiring, Megan and Cori. I want to thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us and really inspirational approach to knowledge and to this type. This is the alarm
timer
that says the webinar is over. But thank you again so much. I thank also our audiences for joining us. Please watch our website for further future events. And yeah, perhaps we can just do a digital clapping for our speakers.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
See you everyone soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.